On a cold March morning in 1917, a single sealed train rolled quietly out of Zurich. No flags, no speeches, no crowd. Inside that train sat 32 people, exiles, revolutionaries, dreamers, and conspirators. Among them was a short, intense man with piercing eyes and a notebook full of plans that would soon redraw the map of the 20th century. The German Empire had allowed this train to pass through enemy territory during wartime. The Russian Provisional Government had no idea it existed. The United States would feel its consequences for the next 100 years. History would later call it the sealed train. But what most Americans were never taught was this: that train did not just carry a revolution to Russia. It carried shock waves that would shape American capitalism, American wars, American fear, and the American century itself. This is the true story of how a single secret journey helped create the world the United States would spend the next century fighting, profiting from, and trying to understand. Part 1. The World Before the Train. In 1917, the world was already breaking. Europe was bleeding itself dry in trenches that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Empires that had stood for centuries, Romanov Russia, Habsburg Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Turkey, were rotting from the inside, held together by tradition, fear, and inertia rather than legitimacy. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with cautious distance. America was rich, industrializing at terrifying speed, and officially neutral. Wall Street financed both sides. American factories fed the war with steel, grain, oil, and ammunition. President Woodrow Wilson spoke of peace while quietly preparing for war. To most Americans, Europe's chaos felt old, foreign, and distant. They did not yet understand that the collapse of the old world would force the United States into a new role, one it had never asked for and would never escape. Russia, in particular, seemed like a relic. An enormous empire ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, a man who believed in divine right while his people starved. Russian peasants lived in conditions closer to the Middle Ages than the modern industrial age. Soldiers fought without boots. Factories ran on exhaustion and fear. Political dissent was answered with exile or execution. Yet beneath the surface, Russia was alive with ideas: socialism, Marxism, anarchism, revolution. For decades, Russian intellectuals had debated how history moved, through gradual reform or violent rupture. Many of those thinkers had been arrested, exiled, or driven abroad. They gathered in cities like Geneva, Zurich, London, and Paris, forming a restless diaspora of revolutionaries waiting for the moment history cracked open. One of them was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known by his alias, Lenin. To American newspapers, if he was mentioned at all, Lenin was a footnote, a radical exile, a fringe ideologue, a nobody. But history is often moved not by famous men, but by prepared ones. Lenin believed something most politicians did not: that war was not a tragedy, it was an opportunity. He argued that imperial wars weakened states, exhausted armies, and radicalized populations. If revolution was ever going to succeed, it would be during total war. In early 1917, his theory was about to be tested. That winter, Petrograd exploded. Bread riots turned into mass protests. Soldiers refused orders. Police melted away. Within days, the Tsar abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule collapsed almost overnight. To the world, it looked like liberation. To Lenin, it looked like Phase 1. The new Russian Provisional Government promised democracy,
free speech, and elections. Western leaders celebrated. American newspapers called it Russia's entry into modernity. But the government made one fatal decision. It stayed in the war. While soldiers starved and factories collapsed, the new leaders chose honor over survival. They believed Russia had a duty to its allies, Britain, France, and increasingly the United States. Lenin knew this would destroy them. There was only one problem. He was stuck in Switzerland. Between him and Russia lay thousands of miles of hostile territory, including Germany, the enemy Russia was still officially fighting. Crossing legally was impossible. Sneaking through was suicide. Unless the enemy helped him. In Berlin, German generals were desperate. The war on the Western Front was frozen. Millions were dead. America was inching closer to intervention. The only way to win was to knock Russia out of the war. Then a German intelligence officer made a radical proposal. What if they didn't defeat Russia with armies, but with ideas? What if they sent the most dangerous revolutionary in Europe back to Russia, like a virus, hoping he would tear the country apart from the inside? It was a gamble, but war makes monsters out of logic. Within weeks, secret negotiations began. Money changed hands, routes were planned, passports were forged, a train was prepared, sealed, guarded, and officially treated as extraterritorial German soil. On paper, it was just a train. In reality, it was a weapon. And on March 27, 1917, it began to roll.
The train did not look extraordinary. It was a standard German passenger carriage, wood-paneled walls, narrow corridors, curtained windows. But its purpose transformed it into something else entirely. Guards were instructed not to enter. No German citizen was allowed to speak to its passengers. Food was passed through doors like offerings to a contained experiment. A strip of white chalk marked the floor. On one side, Germany. On the other, enemies of the German Empire. The passengers were told they were technically not on German soil at all. They were in a legal fiction, an island of neutrality rolling through a continent at war. Lenin approved the arrangement immediately. Morality, he believed, was a luxury of the victorious. Revolution required purity of purpose, not purity of methods. If German imperialism could be used to destroy Russian imperialism, so be it. History would absolve him. As the train lurched forward, Lenin opened his notebook. He did not waste time admiring landscapes or contemplating fate. He wrote relentlessly, outlining strategies, slogans, contingencies. He debated endlessly with fellow passengers, refining arguments with surgical precision. Some of them were uneasy. Were they betraying Russia by accepting German help? Would history remember them as agents rather than revolutionaries? Lenin dismissed such fears. The question is not who helps us, but who we overthrow. Outside the train, Europe burned. They passed through Frankfurt, Berlin, Sassnitz. From there, a ferry crossed the Baltic Sea to Sweden. At every border, German officers ensured smooth passage. Documents were stamped, orders were obeyed. German generals watched from a distance, hoping the man they were sending east would do what their armies could not. They did not fully understand him. Lenin was not loyal to Germany. He was loyal to history, as he interpreted it. By the time the train reached Finland Station in Petrograd on April 3, 1917, Russia had changed again. Crowds flooded the platform, red banners waved, soldiers carried rifles without officers, workers sang revolutionary songs with a hunger that frightened even seasoned activists. Lenin stepped onto the platform and looked around. This was not the cautious liberal revolution he despised. This was chaos. Opportunity. He wasted no time.
Standing on an armored car, he delivered a speech that stunned even his allies. He did not praise the provisional government. He did not call for unity. He did not ask for patience. He demanded everything. Immediate peace, land to the peasants, factories to the workers, all power to the Soviets. Moderates were horrified. Marxists accused him of madness. Western observers dismissed him as an extremist who would quickly fade. American journalists in Petrograd sent back puzzled dispatches. This man, they wrote, was out of step with reality. Russia wanted democracy, not dictatorship. They were wrong. Lenin understood something Americans and many Europeans did not yet grasp. When institutions collapse, people do not choose moderation, they choose certainty. Over the next months, Russia disintegrated further. The provisional government failed to end the war, failed to fix food shortages, failed to control the army. Every failure validated Lenin's message. Behind the scenes, German money flowed into Bolshevik coffers, channeled through banks, couriers, and shell organizations. Pamphlets were printed, newspapers expanded, organizers were paid. Germany told itself it was buying peace. In reality, it was financing a new kind of war. By October 1917, the moment arrived. The Bolsheviks seized key buildings in Petrograd with shocking ease. The Winter Palace fell almost without resistance. The provisional government vanished into history in a single night. Lenin had won. Russia was out of the war. Germany celebrated, briefly, because what Lenin unleashed would outlive the Kaiser, outlast the trenches, and eventually challenge the entire capitalist world, including the United States. Part 3. America Awakens. When news of the Bolshevik takeover reached Washington, confusion reigned. President Woodrow Wilson had just led America into the war, framing it as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. And now one of America's new allies had been replaced by a government that openly rejected democracy itself. At first, the United States tried to ignore it. Official statements were cautious, diplomats waited, maybe Lenin would fail, maybe Russia would stabilize, maybe this was temporary. Wall Street was less patient. American investors had poured billions into Russian railroads, mines, and bonds. Overnight, those assets were declared void. Private property was denounced as theft. Contracts were meaningless. For the first time, American capitalism faced an enemy that did not want negotiation. It wanted abolition. Fear spread quietly at first, through banks, boardrooms, and newspapers read by industrialists. This was not a foreign dispute. This was an ideological virus. If workers in Russia could overthrow elites, why not workers elsewhere? In 1919, the fear exploded. America was hit by a wave of strikes unlike anything it had seen before. Steelworkers, coal miners, dock workers, police, entire cities ground to a halt. Pamphlets circulated, red flags appeared. Immigrants were blamed, radicals were hunted. The government responded with force. The Palmer raids swept through immigrant neighborhoods. Thousands were arrested without warrants. Hundreds were deported. Civil liberties collapsed in the name of national security. Thus began America's long war with an idea. Communism became more than a foreign system. It became a shadow, invoked to crush unions, discredit reformers, and justify surveillance. The sealed train had crossed an ocean. Part 4. The Long Shadow. Lenin did not see the full consequences of his gamble. He died in 1924, leaving behind a fragile state that would soon harden under Stalin. The Soviet Union transformed into an empire of fear, control, and industrial power. The United States responded in kind. World War II temporarily aligned the two powers, but mistrust never faded. When the war ended, the world split in two. NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, capitalism versus communism, Washington versus Moscow. Every proxy war, from Korea to Vietnam, carried echoes of that train. Every CIA operation, every loyalty oath, every nuclear standoff traced part of its logic back to 1917. America defined itself in opposition: free markets versus planned economies, individual liberty versus collective control, democracy versus dictatorship. Yet the irony was unavoidable. The fear of communism reshaped America itself, expanding federal power, militarizing science, and creating an intelligence apparatus that would have horrified earlier generations. The sealed train had not just carried Lenin to Russia, it carried the 20th century into motion. Epilogue: the train that never stopped. Today, the train is gone. The tracks remain only in archives and photographs. Lenin's statue has been torn down in many cities. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. But the consequences persist: in debates over capitalism and inequality, in fears of foreign interference, in the tension between security and freedom. History is often taught as series of grand battles and famous speeches, but sometimes the future turns on quieter moments: a sealed carriage, a notebook, a decision in desperation. On a cold March morning in 1917, a train rolled east. The world is still catching up.